We are a nation of immigrants, we often say. What do you think? What does Jessica Hernandez say about this, such a statement? She actually calls it an anti-Indigenous statement, which is pretty strong. Most people do try to use it as an inclusive statement, or some people try to do that. But it is true that we should be aware that the people who were here before then, indigenous people, the people who were already here thousands of years before it was even called America, which we got from Amerigo Vespucci, who, by the way, Columbus died before America was even named America. That's why, in some ways, when in my son's textbook, they had this whole chapter on the first Americans, and they called the indigenous people the first Americans, as if they were like waving flags already. So I get weirded out by that. The term Native American is certainly an improvement on other terms, but people were here before the continents became named as the Americas, and the whole naming of the Americans took place. After that, in many parts of the Americas, or perhaps all the parts, the colonization process, enslaved Africans were taken to the Americas in great numbers. What do we call all this? What's a phrase that would make a guy professor like me uncomfortable to talk about? It tells him about racism and about settler colonialism. Makes people a little bit uncomfortable when they get challenged with these facts. And I'm glad some people are using this phrase in these days and times and productively connecting it to other issues in the world. It can be an uncomfortable word or an uncomfortable term to grapple with as we consider the actual history of how our country, United States, and other countries in the Americas were developed. What were these Europeans looking for? Resources. And then they keep moving west and cutting things down and killing everything. So it was a weird sense in which people seemed to want to make things just like it was back home. They were afraid of the natural world and afraid of the inhabitants. In other places, especially in Brazil and in the Caribbean and the southern areas, the more tropical areas, they imposed a plantation agriculture, first trying to work with labor from the indigenous people and then importing African laborers in order to grow mostly sugarcane. The indigenous people were caused to labor in other places and subjected to both oppression and disease. And as I've told you about before, some people think there's evidence that this is the first instance because you had this depopulation and repopulation and moving people around so much and deforestation that it all added up to things that can be seen in the ecological record around the year 1610. So at about 100 years after some of those first voyages, you already see the ecological impact of a global climate change that was coming with this interoceanic colonization. Now, once the Europeans had come in and cut down the forest and put in plantation agriculture and mines, and people had been displaced and moved, and now all the animals were in trouble and etc. What was the proposed fix? How do we fix all this? It's the idea of conservation. Stop killing more birds and stop killing more animals, and we're gonna not cut down so many trees now. Hernandez says that conservation is a Western construct. One of the interesting things is we talk all about, oh, we need to do conservation, and there's no such term in many indigenous languages. You didn't need it. It wasn't part of the life. Now, it's not to say that people weren't involved in their environments. What she says is there are other words which have to do with taking care of or care for and in your place, or the idea of healing. And so from Hernandez's perspective, this idea that we need to conserve things was founded and is still generated by some pretty racist people. And some of this has been recognized. For example, the Sierra Club, which always has this great reputation for being wonderful environmentalists. And don't get me wrong, Sierra Club contributor myself. But when John Muir was out there, he really thought he was communing directly with nature and had some pretty yucky, hateful things to say about Black and Indigenous people at the time. So the roots of some of this were not the best. My whole point is this is called Devil's Tower, but in fact, it's a bad translation of, or a mistranslation of, it was once called Bear Lodge, which is the Lakota name. A pretty impressive rock when you're surrounded by prairie. But I remember when I drove across the country and when I was in college and we came to this cool rock and it was actually walled off to people and they said there are indigenous ceremonies going on here, so you can't just go climb it, you weird white people. You can't just go up and take a selfie. It's good to reconceptualize the national park. This is Yellowstone, or one part of Yellowstone. There is this name change from Mount Doan to First Peoples Mountain. And some people get upset about these name changes. I'm not sure exactly why, because this guy that it was named after was one of the people who led in a massacre of indigenous people. So it's weird that some of our Western monuments and mountains were named after people who basically tried to massacre indigenous Americans. It's nice to at least rename those. But what she talks about is this becomes a model around the world that all countries should establish these national parks and basically pick out the indigenous inhabitants. Here, you can go to El Salvador, where she's from. Don't worry, you can go to this national park and take your backpack and stare at the big trees, take a selfie. So it becomes a worldwide model of the national park. Now, on the one hand, there was a lot of idea that people should be eliminated. On the other hand, she tells us to beware of the idea of the ecological noble savage. She talks about this idea of pan-indigeneity, that you conflate indigenous people as monolithic groups despite their differences. So the idea that they're all alike, that all indigenous people are basically the same, and that they are locked in this past, that they aren't in the present, they're in the past. And so it has to do with this idea that indigenous people are these innocent children of nature. And for the Europeans, this became also a stereotype that they weren't using the land, that they weren't working on the land. And on the one hand, it's this romanticized stereotype, but on the other, that idea that they aren't working the land was used as a justification for removing or displacing them, because they had a whole theory that people who work the land in the way that the Europeans worked the land were the ones who should own it. As a point of fact, though, the indigenous people were, and in today's world still are, working and managing the land just in ways that people often didn't recognize at the time, using fire, for example, to reshape the landscape and manage the land, even those people who would be known as hunter-gatherers. They also were building things back then. What did indigenous people build? Now, we usually think of the Egyptian pyramids. We could also think about the Maya cities and pyramids that are there, and the mounds of North America. People would say that they were from outer space or other places. They also had a written system, an interesting way of describing their history, known as a hieroglyphic written system. These beautiful codices. But unfortunately, many of these were destroyed. They got burned up because the Europeans believed that they were inciting rebellions and other things. Same thing that happened with their cities, and some of the architecture was often destroyed. Now, she says that one of the interesting things is that some of these are preserved, but they're in museums that are very far away, either in places like Mexico City or even in European museums. And so the actual indigenous people of today don't have access to them. So she tells us we have to be careful of these ideas that indigenous people are all the same, that they're all gone, that they were all these innocent children of nature, that they didn't have cities or writing or this kind of knowledge. And that although sometimes people want to use the word extinct to call our attention to people, she says we really have to be careful about using a word like extinct. It's important to note that using the word extinct toward an indigenous community is oppressive, given that people cannot go extinct unless the entire species of humans does. So we're all one species. The idea that certain groups of people can go extinct is not correct. We all are one continuous interbreeding species. And so even in places like the Caribbean, where many people were subject to severe oppression, and one of the first places that some of the European diseases were spread, there's still intermixture and survival in these areas. So you have to watch out for that. The idea, you may have heard of this, it's called permaculture. It's a popular idea in various organic agricultural practices. And they got it actually from people in Tasmania, the Australian island of Tasmania, which was subject to some of the worst massacres of people who were said to be extinct. But these researchers then co-opted that and sold that, and didn't really credit the indigenous people for those things. So she gives sort of some examples of people who are trying to write this up and talk about it in books and lectures, like Dr. Enrique Salmon, who wrote a book about kin-centric ecology. And she also talks about the role of what she calls indigenous holistic thinking, which is the idea that we do not separate our world or landscapes into systems in the first place. So she contrasts that with what we sometimes hear in science, or the idea of interdisciplinarity, that we're going to connect different things. And she says, the thing is that indigenous people never separated these things into systems in the first place. And so it's a different thinking about the world, which starts with the whole, or the holistic perspective first, before it all got divided up into disciplines and different systems that are connected. Now, one of the things that she's talking against the whole time here is the idea that we take a top-down approach to our research. She gives an example of anthropologists who come in. Hernandez is definitely not an anthropologist, and her aunt is like, hey, watch out for these people. They're trying to be like anthropologists who came in and took our knowledge away, and then we don't have that. And so there's an idea that many indigenous groups became very suspicious about the work of anthropologists because they seemed like they were coming in to study them, but not actually contributing to them. So what should I do? So here I am up here on the stage being a white guy and an anthropologist and old. I was going to say, what should we do? But I don't want to lump us all together. What should people do who may not necessarily identify as indigenous? How should we approach these issues? Hernandez says, try to work from not a top-down approach, but a bottom-up approach. So try to figure out what people actually need. So she talks about what is called CBPR, community-based participatory research, which you try to be collaborative about. But then she has some ideas about respecting that it has to be modified for indigenous communities because you need to respect tribal sovereignty and indigenous autonomy. So this is important if you're especially doing research in or within another community, to try and start from the bottom, not the top. It is important to be respectful of people And that's why, in some ways, we try to encourage not to appropriate other people's knowledge, but to give credit where you can. And so you don't want to just say it came out of your head when it might have come from somebody else's work and life. If it is possible, you should offer payment to people for their wisdom and knowledge. Oh, that's a big word. Recognizing Indigenous heterogeneity, which is basically to say not all Indigenous people are the same. And there are going to be differences between different groups and also within different groups. So basically, watch out for the stereotypes that we often still carry, that people are either all evil, all bad, or all wonderful and all good. Neither one of those are very helpful for navigating today's world. And so when we're traveling around and going to places like Devil's Tower, when you're traveling and exploring and looking at people in the natural world, and maybe you'll go to a national park in El Salvador somewhere, just be aware, where are the people here? Who might have been here, or why is this presented to me as the natural world, or who should be included in my landscape and travels as I'm seeking out nature.